Today's occurrence happens in Germany when Manfred Bachneck attended a festival he had been attending since he turned 18 in 2001. He never imagined that 9 years later, things would turn out the way they did. When he attended the festival this time, he was excited to enter the festival grounds, especially once he heard the music starting. He remembered going through a tunnel to get to the venue and exiting it, noticing there were only two ways to go, straight or to the right. Manfred noticed that there were no signs telling the huge crowd around him where to go or even where the exit was. So he stood there a moment before walking towards the staircase off to the side, moving with the rest of the crowd. But once people went up the stairs, he thought this couldn't be happening. He was recording everything for the memories, and right now he was filming a woman going up the stairs. The way she was moving up the stairs caught his eye, and when she made it to the top, she was crying. He could tell something was wrong. Things were going wrong, but he thought, hopefully, everything would all be okay. Everyone would be okay. But the more people tried moving in one direction or the other, the tighter things felt. The more people started panicking and scrambling to make it to those stairs, the stairs the girl was crying at the top of, Manfred could hear people starting to shout and shove. People saying they can't do this anymore, yelling for help, screaming, people being carried over the heads of others up the stairs. Soon, people were desperate enough to climb on top of each other, yelling at each other to fight and hold on, and just when the squeezing and shoving felt too tight, not even 5 minutes later, the crowd cleared and there was space. Looking around, Manfred could see two people on the ground. They weren't moving, and they didn't look well. So he tried to revive them by mouth to mouth, but they didn't wake up. They never woke back up. And all Manfred could think about was how he had this feeling, a strong feeling, that those two people walked in alive with him, in the same crowd as him. But now, they were dead. And those two people weren't the only ones. They were among hundreds of people killed or injured in a crowd crush devastating enough to put an end to the festival forever. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of the Love Parade disaster. The Love Parade started in 1989 as a small free music festival and parade that had less than 200 people in it, in Berlin. In just 6 years, 700,000 people would be attending the event from all over the world. It brought together fans of techno music, unable to get into their own futures and not wanting to live in the present, but enjoy music that lets them loosen up and forget about their troubles. The goal was to party for as long as possible. Berlin brought in upwards of $70 million for the Love Parade, which was described as a party, but also a demonstration of peace. It was the first type of event where young people from all over felt that they could gather and be entertained without violence. There weren't really any fights or danger at the Love Parade during that time. Well, outside of an occasional bomb threat, but nothing that was acted upon. By 1999, about 1.5 million people were attending the Love Parade, and 2 years after that, its label of being a political demonstration was revoked. This meant that instead of the city covering cleanup cost and most of the security, the organizers had to cover it. In the years that followed, the Love Parade lost sponsors. There were complaints on unchecked illegal substance trafficking, environmental damages from trash and littering, and safety concerns. Masses of mostly young people doing all of that, plus raving half-dressed, wasn't exactly loved by everyone. The loss of sponsors, because of the bad attention the Love Parade sometimes attracted, got to the point where in 2004, the organizers failed to secure the funding needed to put on what had ultimately become the world's largest techno event. The Love Parade wouldn't return to Berlin until 2006, under a new sponsor, and that was the last year Berlin granted a permit for the event. The Senate of Berlin had too many concerns to feel comfortable approving it. So the year after, its new sponsor moved the event to Western Germany. The new sponsor was the largest German gym chain, McFit Limited. McFit CEO Raina Shala bought the Love Parade trademark and organized the festival as CEO of Lopevent Limited. After that, the Love Parade would take place in different West German cities each year, breaking the all-time attendance record in 2008 with 1.6 million people in Dortmund, Germany. In 2009, there was again no Love Parade. This time, it wasn't because of financial issues, but because Bochum city officials refused to grant a permit because they feared the safety concerns. Officially, they believed the train station wouldn't be able to support the amount of people predicted to attend the parade. Those wanting to attend were upset, but knew the next time the Love Parade was happening, they had to go. In 2010, it was announced that it would be back and taking place in Duisburg. The festival was normally more of a parade-type festival celebration, with floats where artists performed moving as a procession downtown. There would also be stages and floats with DJs and events in an open area. This year, things would be a bit different, but they had to be if organizers wanted the Love Parade to go on. The city and the organizing company, Lopevent, decided to host the event at the former freight train station. Everything would happen there. The slogan for the event was "The Art of Love," and it was a huge part of a campaign to celebrate one of 2010's European capitals of culture, the Ruhr Valley, where Duisburg is located. On July 24th, when the festival was to begin, Bruce Cullen, an American artist on float number 7, talked with a few other artists. They all had some concerns about how the event would run. They all agreed that it looked like it wasn't going to work. It didn't look planned right, and the idea of floats that moved traditionally down city streets being confined to the enclosed area with attendees just didn't seem right. Already, the morning of the event, admittance started around an hour late. Construction in the central area was still happening when people were supposed to be let in around 11 a.m., so they weren't admitted until noon. It wasn't seen as a terribly huge deal at the time. They weren't expecting super high numbers of attendees until around 5 and 6 p.m. But by the time they did allow people in, there was already a large crowd, eager and waiting to be let in. By 2 p.m., the festival had begun with performers on the floats moving around the designated route near the main entrance. Organizers wanted the performers to draw attendees to join the parade and then keep walking along the route and into the main area. So let me just describe the layout of this event. If you make a circle with both of your hands, left thumb tip touches the right thumb tip, left index finger touches the right, so on and so forth with all of your fingers, assuming you're able to do that. But you make a circle, and that is the entirety of the event site. It was on the northern section of the station grounds, but in the middle of the circle is the train depot, and it takes up most of the space. The parade floats would move in an oval around the freight depot. That was their route, driving in circles around that building. That building is in the center of the circle your hand is forming. Now, to get to the festival area, the float route, the circle inside of your hands, attendees had to go to one of 2 access control points. These were on the east and west sides of the grounds and controlled who could enter. So picture them as the west side access point being your left thumb joint, and then the east being your right thumb joint. Once through there, visitors could continue through the path to the main entry and exit points from either side. That is represented by the rest of your thumb. Where the tips of your thumbs touch is where the main entrance ramp extends upward to touch the bottom of the float route around the stadium. People could enter the ramp as it was the only entrance to the event site. Anyone entering was being met with the performers going around the train depot on floats. The main entrance ramp was also the main exit. Just to the left of the main ramp, so like where your left thumb's interphalangeal joint is, the part of your thumb that bends to push buttons when you're playing video games, that is where a second smaller ramp is for a second exit. The main entrance and exit ramp meets the parade float routes as it's starting a circle around the train depot, and the smaller ramp being used for a second exit kind of meets the float route where it's ending and coming back around towards the front of the train depot. Hardly anyone is actually aware of the second, smaller exit. Most are only aware of that main ramp. Hopefully this is making sense so far. So if you're coming from the east access point, the right thumb knuckle, then you are passing through a long tunnel to get to the main entry and exit ramp. If you're entering from the west, the left thumb knuckle, then you're going under 3 bridges. It runs under an area outside of the event, under the small exit, and opens up into the main entrance and exit ramp, where the tips of your thumbs are touching. Now, police officer Thornton Meyer made it there around 30 minutes after the floats and performers began moving, and he was in charge of around 100 or so riot officers. He was working the second shift. Thornton felt like things were out of control. They would solve one problem, and another would pop up. The bag of issues kept getting heavier and heavier. Problems were piling up. Thornton went to check on the tunnel traffic and took a few steps into the tunnel when he was first called to go meet the event organizers, crowd manager, by his section leader. Organizers also felt like there were a lot of issues happening at the same time, and they kind of needed to have better coordination and figure out what they were going to do. Everyone needed to get on the same page. The upper part of the main ramp was starting to fill up and get congested as more people arrived. Everyone going up the ramp was moving into the float route, which caused the floats to be unable to move or caused people to stop and wait for the floats to pass so they could continue into the venue. By 3:30 p.m., the crowd manager and police were in the crowd manager's container, which I'm guessing is a shipping container, building, or area above the ramp where they were stationed. They were all worried about how the situation was progressing. Police wanted to focus on crowd management, and the crowd manager wanted to put that focus on breaking up the crowd at the top of the main ramp entrance. Essentially, they were agreeing on the same problem, so together it was decided to close off the east and west access points so no one else could enter the tunnel from outside and continue to get stuck on the main ramp. Around 3:50 p.m., an ambulance passes through from the west access area to the east. A little after that, police officers form a line blocking anyone coming through the west access point from being able to pass through the part of the tunnel that goes under the smaller exit ramp. A couple of stragglers are able to exit the area from behind the police and walk against anyone entering in, but after that, no one is let in or out through police line 1. So visitors coming from the left thumb joint can't get past the part in your left thumb that bends to push buttons. Moments later, a second police line is formed close to the east access point on the east side of the tunnel, around the right thumb knuckle joint. And this suggestion was Thornton's idea. He figured it would be better to block those spots rather than block the actual main ramp. There were already a lot of people hanging around in the tunnel, and by blocking further away, the entrance was out of view, so people wouldn't be as drawn to it. Pressure from people coming up to the entrance would reduce, and people wouldn't cram into each other's backs trying to reach the venue. Now, it's around 4 o'clock, and the police lines are in place. From the west entrance, a small number of people are approaching police line 1, and they realize they can't go any further. And literally within 2 minutes, that small group turned into a huge surge of people approaching the police line. Allegedly, the west access point had been ordered by police to open up again. At this point, people witnessed police line 1 move back a little more, so now the police line is behind the smaller exit ramp. So in front of them is a smaller exit ramp with the few people who know it exists trying to leave, and people from the west access point are trying to come in. Behind them is the main entrance and exit ramp, and on the opposite side of the tunnel is police line 2, stopping people from coming in from the east. Now, at the same time as police line 1 moved back is when a third line of police officers formed on the lower third of the main entry and exit ramp. They formed it because they noticed a lot of attendees were trying to leave. Where the third police line formed was at the narrowest point of the ramp, because they set the line up against some forgotten fencing that cut into the ramp space on both sides. So there was fencing coming out from the left wall of the ramp and the right wall of the ramp, and then the police were just forming a line between that. A large crowd of people wanting to leave gathered at police line 3, and all the lines are in place for around 15 minutes. During this time, the area between all 3 police lines almost fully empties out. So that's the area on the other side of the smaller exit ramp, leading up to the main ramp from the west and the entirety of the tunnel from the east access point. It's also right around that 15-minute mark that police line 2 at the east access point starts to dissolve. Thornton was told by unit commanders in the tunnels that large numbers of people were coming in from outside. It didn't make sense because the tunnels were supposed to be closed off at the entrances. There were so many visitors trying to get in that the pressure was pushing too heavily on the police line and an altercation broke out. At that point, unit commanders told Thornton that the lines wouldn't hold. So Thornton thought they could at least use the police line to move people towards the ramp in a controlled and slow kind of manner, like slowly angle them towards it. He assumed whatever was going on at the top of the ramp would be solved soon. There were supposed to be officers acting as pushers and moving the crowd at the top of the ramp where it meets with the parade floats and kind of get them moving and cleared out. Thornton's idea worked for like a few minutes, but as far as controlling people's movements to the main ramp, once people started moving, they just broke through police line. So people are now able to come from the east and have full access to the main entrance and exit ramp where they will run into the other 2 police lines from behind. 5 minutes later, now around 4:20 p.m., the police closed Duisburg Central Station because too many visitors were arriving and some were crossing the train tracks outside of the venue. At the same time, Police Line 1, the one between the smaller exit and the main ramp, dissolved. This time, it's a bit more controlled, but for the next 10 to 20 minutes, the amount of people moving towards the main entrance ramp is unchecked, and things go downhill quickly. There are people from the east and west entrances approaching Police Line 3, near the bottom of the ramp from behind. So now, Police Line 3 has this huge crowd of people wanting to leave in front of them, and a massive crowd approaching from behind, wanting access to the parade. Thousands of people who have been waiting, wanting to go in opposite directions, but no one actually going anywhere. The unit commander for Line 3 dissolved his ramp line without hearing an order from Thornton. He did it because the pressure between both groups became way too much for officers. After dissolving Line 3, that unit commander tore down the fencing that was up so people could move over the bank. It fixed the congestion on the upper ramp. Officers down below couldn't see that though. Previously, Thornton figured if they were stuck down in the crowd alone, they would be powerless. So when he dissolved the line and said he ordered others to do so too, he climbed up to the upper area, apparently trying to influence things from above. By 4:30, just 10 minutes after the police lines went down and people started moving freely, the atmosphere on the ramp changed. And according to footage of the event, Thornton was allegedly standing on the upper level, overlooking the ramp, and says he didn't realize the severity of what happened next. It was around this time that all those trapped in the bottleneck started realizing they were in trouble. One witness said the people in front of them were pressing so hard against their chest that they thought they were going to be crushed and suffocated. They suffered in unimaginable pain. Someone else described their chest being increasingly compressed until they were gasping for air and trying to push people away. They barely managed to get their arms in front of their ribcage to protect themselves. People were crushed so tight that they couldn't feel or control their arms. One person reported that their hands ended up over a girl's face and they couldn't control it. The girl bit her hand hard trying to get her to move it so she could breathe. Others reported having sores and wounds on their hands and arms from being squeezed by others or pushed or shoved when they couldn't move their limbs themselves. Then the fainting started, with one person saying, quote, "I saw at the time around me, I could overlook a crowd of maybe 100 people, several of whom I assumed were unconscious. So I'm not sure, but the heads were sometimes hanging down crookedly, and others were shaking and screaming, and somewhere I also saw that someone was trying to give air to someone who was squeezed in, standing up, and somehow took air at the top and blew in at the bottom." End quote. Someone who described what passing out there felt like said, the air lessened until they saw black dots in front of their eyes, and then they passed out and couldn't see anything. Now, most people who fainted fell down, but some were held up by others, with someone saying, quote, "It didn't take long before the man fainted again. I noticed myself that it was getting tighter and tighter. I tried as long as possible to hold the man, it was no longer possible. I had to protect myself. The man slowly slipped away, downwards. Then, I didn't see him anymore. The people were immediately pressing together above him. There was simply no one who could get out of the way." End quote. People trapped in the crowd, surrounded by different groups, trying to go in different directions, described a wave motion. Yes, crushes can happen from just being locked upright in place, but a survivor reported that as the crowd got worse and worse, in waves, that they lost their upright position more and more. Their upper body was pushed forwards, but technically, they didn't move their feet. Witnesses couldn't really tell if the movement felt like they were moving front to back or if they were moving left to right. But some of those that survived explained how they tried to handle themselves by moving with the wave and not resisting it, or by absorbing the pressure and trying to keep their balance. One of them said, quote, "Then came the pressure waves. I felt pressure from behind and had to try and compensate with my upper body so as not to fall on other people. You could no longer move your feet because there was no room to the side. These pressure waves were actually always there, sometimes more, sometimes less. At some point, it was so tight that you couldn't compensate for anything with your upper body." End quote. While some people were able to move with the wave to their advantage, usually taller or larger people, relative to those that were around them, others couldn't. For one person, at some point, the pressure behind them suddenly disappeared, and they fell backwards towards the wall. They fell on the people standing behind them. For another, a wave came that pushed them to the ground, and they fell on their knees and supported themselves with their hands. But some people behind them stepped on their legs, and others fell on top of them. Anyone who lost their balance and was pushed to the ground ended up being walked or fallen on, or found themselves doing the same to others who fell before them. Someone who lost balance and was pushed to the ground, but managed to use their arms to lift up their upper body, said, quote, "Since I did not manage to stand up, it was then that some people stood on top of me during the next wave. To this I must say that this situation was of course much more than only frightening for me. Since I didn't know any other way to help myself, I pinched the leg of a girl in front of me and told her that if she didn't make sure I was pulled up, that I wouldn't be able to take it much longer. This girl then told all the people standing around me, and somehow they all managed to pull me up together. When I stood again, I saw in the immediate vicinity, I would say 1 or 2 meters away from me, a young woman lying on the ground. I shouted that she should be helped, and could see that she had blood on her face. She had one eye closed and the other opened. Shortly after, I could no longer see her because the crowd simply trampled over her." End quote. Once people fell, a domino effect sometimes happened with people piling up. Other times, the piling up happened because there was a hole in the crowd. So after someone disappeared, where they were, there was a gap where the people who were standing next to them tried to keep from falling over on top of whoever fell first. The people around them supported each other as best they could, but if the person didn't get up in time, those trying to keep standing around them would become too weak and were pushed into the gap. One person said, quote, "I saw someone pass out and slump down. Some others wanted to pick him up again and bent down, but because the crowd was pushed from behind, these people also fell down. And then more and more tripped over them, and then there were many people lying on top of each other. It was a whole mountain. There must have been at least 35 people." End quote. There were reports of dozens of people lying on top of each other, and up to 40 people being stuck. Even when it was less dense around the piles, they stayed in the piles for a pretty long time. 2 clear instances of piling up happened on the main ramp and for specific reasons. Looking at the ramp, if you're trying to go up it and enter into the festival area, along the left wall, there's a bright pink or purplish billboard, and right beside that billboard are stairs going up, and another way to access the event site. The stairs are very narrow, like it's not a stairway that looks like it's meant for traffic or for more than 1 or 2 people to try and be on it at a time. In fact, the stairs were barricaded and fenced off, but people pushed past or jumped the barrier. Opposite of that, along the right wall of the main ramp, are 3 light poles. They aren't smooth metal or wooden light posts. They have metal bars running across them, completely climbable if you're determined. Now remember, there are different groups of people in this mass. Because everyone's converging on the same ramp, people on the grounds above the ramp are trying to leave the festival to go home. The ones trying to figure out why every possible way to leave is blocked. People on the ramp desperately fighting to get out, wherever out may lead. And then there are those that are not realizing what's happening on the ramp, but trying to either get to event grounds or leave them. All of these people are trying to access the main ramp. The objects I just mentioned, the billboard, the stairs, the light poles, and even the container the police were at, were all seen as either ways to escape the crowd crush or leave festival grounds. Once one person did it, many people saw it as a way out. People began climbing the stairs and light poles almost as soon as things started getting tight. But the more people saw that as an escape, or worse, saw people being lifted to the stairs looking poorly, the more panic spread. People started climbing on the heads of others, shoving and moving towards the alternative exits. Those who weren't even wanting to go towards the stairs were pushed there against their will due to how strong of a shift in movement the crowd had in that direction. Some people up top realized what was happening and tried to lift people up. One police officer made hand movements in a way that asked everyone to come to the stairs. At least, that's how it was interpreted by people who saw it. They couldn't tell if he meant a specific person or people or everyone. He waved people towards him with both of his arms. People didn't know what to do, and there were no signs. There was no communication. So people trying to stay and leave would flock to those possible exit points and cause clogging that led to pileups as people got trampled by those coming or going. And things were made worse when more people noticed one or two police officers moving down the stairs to try and pull out people wedged and in need of help. At some point, a police bus drove through the crowd in the opposite direction, causing a counterflow, and that just exacerbated the situation. Up to this point, witnesses could see blue faces and lips, open and empty eyes. And the more people started realizing those around them were dead or dying, the louder and more aggressive the screaming and panic became. People who are so focused on making it to the stairs or the poles to get out that almost everyone failed to realize space had opened up in the middle and upper areas of the ramp. One person said, quote, "To get up there, I thought I would actually have to go up the ramp. Funnily enough, because the people from above didn't push so hard, I just walked up the ramp. I went in the direction of the stairs, that is, where the stairs ended. There I then photographed how the people were cared for. So it took me about 7 minutes from the foot of the stairs up and to the top. I was still thinking, why doesn't everybody go this way?" End quote. Shorter people trapped in the crowd couldn't see over the heads of people around them and didn't know where they were or where the crowd was pushing them to. Lack of direction from police officers also led to confusion. For example, the officer waving his arms at people and not really specifying what he meant by it. Those wanting to leave the festival and confused why the main entrance was seemingly the only exit walked into the dangerous crowd from where they could access the ramp from the festival area. They described just wanting to leave and not being able to find anywhere to exit. It seemed like the only exit was the entrance ramp, and there were fences everywhere, so you couldn't go through anywhere else. As far as they could tell, going down the ramp was the only option, and the situation seemed normal for the most part. One witness described slowly realizing the situation by saying, quote, "We didn't even know at first that the stairs were actually blocked off. We were initially surprised that it went so slowly and that people had to be helped up. You could also see some desperate expressions on the faces of stewards. To be honest, I sometimes thought it couldn't be true. It's not easy when someone resists, but it took them about 1.5 minutes with 3 people to pull up someone who wasn't really that tall. We were still maybe 2 or 3 meters away from this staircase where you noticeably couldn't make any more movement towards it, and that's when the first girl was pulled up the stairs, unconscious, by her feet. And that was when it started to get really bad. That's when the first ones really started to panic. Probably those behind us did not know what was going on in front and did not understand the signs and thought, let's just push, as is the case at such events. End quote. And that right there is something I believe most people can relate to in some way or another. Being in a crowd, wanting to come or go home, and just kind of pushing a little, trying to get the people in front of you to go a bit faster. You think if you try to make them move quicker, then the people in front of them might move a bit faster. Or maybe they'll just move out of the way and you can continue on your own way. Or you're the one being pushed from behind and now you're moving forward to get away from them, which is causing the people in front of you to move forward too. But what stood out to me, Anna Sieben and Armin Seyfried, who analyzed eyewitness perspectives on this event, was that the witness saw the look on the steward's face, saw people looking unwell, and could sense something wrong in the air. And it wasn't until they were essentially gridlocked, witnessing someone knocked out, being dragged by their toes out of what was undoubtedly a massive crowd, that they put together what was going on. In their defense, the crowd faced away from them, so they couldn't really see the faces of the crowd, only the steward. But then they assumed that the people behind them weren't aware of what they saw, so they didn't realize that they should stop pushing because they weren't moving because something was wrong. Information moves slowly in large crowds, even when people are close together, especially if the people in said crowd have tunnel vision trying to get to a specific location. You would think they could hear the screams, but not necessarily. In large enough crowds, sounds don't travel as far as you'd think they would. Now, as for the people that are panicking seeing people being dragged out of the crowd, even though it comes across as a bit short-sighted and selfish, they started climbing over people to make it to the poles and shipping containers at the expense of others. But there were still a lot of people who did try to help. Some people walked on heads to get out, but there were hundreds of instances where people lifted others up and out of the crowd, up the stairs, or to rescuers. One person reported supporting an unconscious person in their arms for up to 20 minutes. Others reported slapping people who fainted to try and wake them up. One group of people noticed a girl without a pulse, and they managed to get her up in the air and over to rescuers. People lying on the floor were sometimes protected by bystanders as best they could and encouraged to hang on and keep fighting. If people had water to try and get to someone near them, they would do it. Others would risk their lives to help others who were in danger. One person said, quote, "One of them, who probably died herself, saved me from death when I could not move, and people climbed over us. If she had not held her arm over my head at the last moment, my fate would probably have been a broken neck." End quote. Another person who was helping a woman stay up couldn't support her anymore, and she fell to the ground. The person who was helping her was so drained, they just couldn't do it anymore, and could feel the air leaving their own body while they started losing their vision. There were thousands of stories like these, not just by those experiencing or surviving it, but by those who witnessed it or jumped in to help after, trying to resuscitate people, like Manfred, who went on to be a teacher. Now, the entire setup was doomed to fail with respect to the crowd size. From the very beginning, an expert by the name of Jürgen Gerlach was tasked with determining the cause of this disaster and what could have prevented it. Starting with the location of the Love Parade, it was closed off, yes, but they put a fence around the event location to meet regulations. But that was because of its surroundings. On one side of the venue was the highway. On the other side were railway tracks. The central station was above it, and below it was that tunnel. To get to the east and west access points, the only way to access the event, attendees followed one of two paths north of the venue that led them down to the access points at each end of the tunnel. To go through the access points, you had to go through a turnstile, which is about 2 feet or half a meter wide. That was essentially the entrance, a 2-foot wide turnstile before going through the tunnel from whichever end and converging with people going from the opposite entrance and going up the entrance ramp to the Love Parade. There was more than one turnstile. There were several side by side at each access point, but not nearly enough for the expected amount of people. There are hundreds of thousands of people waiting on the streets leading to the turnstiles, and on the other side of them, like not even 100 people have just passed through on their way to the tunnel. Like, they needed 10 times whatever they had if that was the method they were going to be using to admit everyone. But with the size and the system they had going, it wasn't efficient. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't safe. Now, as people start going up the ramp, they have to consider the parade floats, how that's slowing them down, and then on top of that, there's this sense of amazement at going up the ramp and seeing the venue open up in front of them. All of this makes the top of the ramp another guaranteed bottleneck area. So you have the access points with the turnstiles and the top of the main ramp. According to the expert for things to move as planned, the float route path would have needed to be nearly 200 feet wide or 60 meters. In reality, it was around 92 feet or 28 meters. By the time everyone was trapped and struggling to survive at 4:49 p.m., everyone was pushing in wave patterns towards the light poles, the container, or the stairs. Whatever a certain group of people shifted towards as a possible escape route or direction, the group moved in waves. The same waves that picked people up and pushed them down. The waves that ultimately killed dozens and injured hundreds. Just 5 minutes before that, though, organizers announced that the festival area had to be closed because of overcrowding. This was announced at the same time that hundreds of thousands of people were waiting to get inside, and around the time that CEO Raina Shala was doing an interview not far from the main ramp and saying that the event was a success. Around 5:20 p.m., more people had snuck in through the barriers to get into the festival or to escape overcrowding. People trying to climb the stairway fell off into the crowd while trying to escape, but ultimately the ramp ended up clearing up. And it wasn't until that point where people saw the sheer amount of people that had been trampled or killed. People were finally pulled out of the piles. Resuscitation efforts were in full force, and paramedics were able to move in and help transport severely wounded people. A nearby motorway that was closed during the festival was used as an access route for emergency vehicles. It wouldn't be until 30 minutes later when police announced that an accident occurred where 10 people died, 10 had been resuscitated, and 15 were hurt. This was also around the time Thornton says he discovered people died, and the number would only grow from there. Thornton said that after the upper level was cleared, once the ramp unit leader moved the fencing after dissolving the third police line, he indicated to the squad leader he made eye contact with that everyone at the bottom of the stairs on the left side of the main ramp weren't looking up anymore. They were all crammed together. Thornton indicated to the officer to move people to the upper area, but the officer said no, because it was full. Thornton claims he replied back telling him it was empty now and to get people out and over the ramp. He kept radioing to tell officers that they needed to get everyone up and over the ramp. Thornton said that reception was spotty, so like half the time communications wouldn't go through using radios. To communicate with setting up the police lines and other information around that time, he said they were using runners to relay information between parties. So officers running back and forth across the event site to pass along messages. There were a lot of people with strong feelings towards officers after this happened, and I do have my questions about him being concerned and saying he noticed people struggling and radioing to get everyone moving, but then not sending runners to double check or not going to check himself. Like, with communication issues already making a mess of everything, I don't know. Wait, do your own research, form your own opinions. I'm referencing publicly available information that I had access to and just connected the dots in real time. I believe that when the police lines went up, event security working the access points were supposed to stop people too. But because the access point area was so small, it became unsafe for those waiting. So they felt like they had to let people through. Maybe officers were able to communicate with each other, even if it was spotty, but event security and crowd control teams couldn't communicate with them. They had no way of updating officers on how the access points were being overwhelmed and how they needed help or how they were going to start letting people through due to the safety concerns. I'm just thinking about how Thornton said in an interview that officers were confused why so many people were still coming through to the police lines, as though people shouldn't have been entering the grounds. And then the way he talked about the communication issues, along with the other reports, yeah, for legal purposes, that's alleged. Now, Thornton can be seen in footage standing on the upper level over the ramp, fully watching the stairs where people were struggling and dying and climbing light poles. I mean, it's a rave. Maybe he just brushed it off the way cops do at events like that. I'm not familiar with German policing, but Thornton says he couldn't see how bad it was. Maybe he was helping, but he didn't realize what was going on. He said it looked problematic. He admitted that, but he said there was a lot of movement, but he didn't think it looked deadly. When he found out people died, he felt guilty because he watched people die. Like, he didn't see them dying. He said he wasn't able to see them die, but at the end of the day, that's sort of what he did. And being a father to a daughter and stepson, he had a hard time coping with that. He understands sending your children somewhere where you expect them to be safe and come home healthy, and instead, this time the opposite happened. As a cop, he knows people trust them to keep people safe, but they didn't keep people safe. Thornton asked the question, what could have been done differently? Well, by 7 p.m., the crisis management team of the Duisburg authorities decided to keep the festival open to prevent further panic and aggression from attendees. 45 minutes later, the mayor of Duisburg, Adolf Sauerland, and the Secretary of Interior of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia held the first press conference of the crisis management team. The love parade continued until 11 p.m. The death toll reached 21 people, aged 18 to 38, 13 women, and 8 men. 13 of the victims were from Germany. The rest were from Spain, Australia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Italy, the Netherlands, and China. Most of them were pronounced dead at the love parade. 5 later died in the hospital. Autopsies revealed that all 21 deaths were from crushed rib cages and others panicking from pressure from the crowd, which led some to be trampled to death. They weren't able to get enough oxygen into their bodies. More than 650 people were injured. Families of victims were contacted by the consulate of their countries. Once word got out that CEO Raina Shala was doing an interview while everything fell apart just feet away, that people were still partying while others were dying, that they let the festival continue on, there were 3 main people that the public wanted to answer for what happened. It was between Raina, Adolf, and the police. The police trade union blamed organizers for the poorly planned event. They accused them of putting their own interest above people's safety. Raina claimed that the tragedy was actually on police and how they managed the situation, not on him. He blamed the police lines for the deaths and said that everything he planned and did was approved by appropriate authorities. Raina also said that there would never again be another love parade out of respect for the victims. He was permanently canceling the festival. Adolf also blamed the police, but the public mostly blamed him. The police deflected his accusations and said their responsibility ended at the isolation barriers. Everything else, especially what happened in the tunnel, was on organizers and the city. The public sort of agreed. They believed it was clear that the mayor's office rushed the planning and pressured building authorities, the fire department, and more to approve whatever was needed. Allegedly, experts contacted the mayor with their concerns, but because the mayor was on vacation, he left planning and approvals to his administration. The administration suggested parties constructively collaborate so that the representative could deny involvement if the location for the festival was approved. But there were reservations somewhere because the building authority wouldn't even grant the permit for the festival until 3 days before it took place. They were being pressured to agree, with the deadline being literally on top of them, so they caved. The mayor approved regulations the day before the love parade. City officials called for the mayor to resign, and someone completely fed up with all of the finger pointing published internal city documents from the city's administration relevant to planning the love parade. Now, the city government ordered those documents to be removed from the website it was posted on, but WikiLeaks released them a few days later. And then eventually, the mayor was run out of office. With a disaster this large in scale and appearing to be due to shady practices, you'd think the way things end up would be different. Families of victims tried to get justice in courts in their own countries. That wasn't possible. So they went through the German courts, even though most of them doubted the system was able to evaluate a case of this scale and this complicated. Now, things on site directly contributing to the disaster was obviously the main ramp, being the only one used as an entrance and exit, especially considering the amount of people. But what made it worse was that the ramp was about 85 feet or 26 meters wide initially. With police cars parked on the side, food trucks, and fences, the actual amount of space people had to navigate that ramp was 36 feet or 11 meters of space. And there weren't separate lanes or anything to divide traffic flow, just an open ramp. Now, everything I've touched on surrounding what factors led to this happening shows an egregious amount of carelessness or negligence at best. That being said, as far as what was revealed in courts and leaked documents, everything I'm going to say from here on out is alleged. You'll understand why. The German police and state attorney opened a criminal investigation into what happened, but a Duisburg court rejected the case in 2016. They believed prosecutors failed to, quote, establish proof for the acts of negligence the defendants have been charged with and for their casualty, end quote. Professor and British crowd safety expert Keith Still wrote a report that the charges were based on. The court believed that the report was filled with many flaws and was described as sloppily written and full of errors. Attorneys for the victims criticized the report too, believing Keith ignored mistakes made by police, which caused prosecutors to only go after event organizer staff and the city. By 2017, 7 years after the Love Parade disaster, a higher regional court agreed that the criminal charges against 10 people should go ahead. The charges were against 6 Duisburg city officials. They were charged with negligent manslaughter and inflicting bodily harm. The hearings began on December 8th, 2017. Case files for the case were so large they were brought by truck and had more than 50,000 pages and 1,000 annex folders. Victim relatives, like Gabriella Muller, who lost her son, Christian, in the parade, didn't care for revenge. She was focused on making peace with what happened and could only do that once everything was done. For many of the joint plaintiffs, their concerns were about how German courts would treat the case and about how the statutes of limitations may run out before it even closed. They had until July 2020 to get justice. There were many testimonies from survivors, police officers, and others involved. Officer Thornton Meyer gave his statements. CEO Raina Shala gave his too. On the day of his questioning, the judge wanted to start questioning him right away, but Raina asked the judge to address victim families first. The press and victims' families felt his read statement was totally scripted by a PR agency. Specifically, several of the parents of Love Parade victims believed Raina was emotionless. They described him in the courtroom by saying that his hands stayed stiff with one crossed over the other the entire time. He had some worry lines on his face, but it was obvious he was concentrating a lot and clearly coached. The entire 7 hours, they said he was sitting there, and he didn't move at all except for one sip of water. To them, he was clearly acting. Allegedly, Mayor Adolf Sauerland testified that the first he heard of any political demands was through the media and press. Tasks were given by Adolf setting up a project and then just forwarding the info to the Department of Public Order. Allegedly, Adolf's role didn't handle authoritative duties because he wanted people that specialized in those areas to oversee the details. He claims he didn't have any direct contact with the groups involved in planning the parade, only the head of the Department of Public Order. He just kind of delegated everything out without being informed himself. His only responsibility, the day of the parade, was to report to organizers. He did do a press conference, but it was just to say that they had 1.5 million attendees. But that wasn't the truth. Apparently he had said that amount because that's the amount of people that were in the city that day, not the amount at the festival. Allegedly, he did that because he signed an NDA that made him conceal the true amount of attendees. The true figures were closer to 250,000 people on site, and he was aware of that being the amount before the parade even started, which is at least partially true, because allegedly, in documents dated in the months leading up to the Love Parade, original estimates were at first in the millions. A description by Lope Event, estimated that the max number of visitors that would eventually be able to attend was 450,000, with 250,000 being the max number of people in the actual event venue at the same time. It would later go on to urge the highest level of confidentiality as far as publicizing the numbers, because it could significantly damage the public reputation of the Love Parade. So the numbers used in media, as far as expected and actual visitors, would differ. They knew it wouldn't be possible to actually exceed their estimates, because 90% of those visitors would come by train, and Duisburg Station couldn't handle more than that. Now, in an earlier meeting, Lopevent and a few departments of the city administration met and discussed how the event space was completely inadequate. It could only have a maximum of 180,000 visitors. Even if they lowered their estimates from the millions that they originally had to 500,000, they could probably only have 300,000 visitors at the same time. The problem was described as unsolvable, and it was noted that the possibility of criminal prosecution was pointed out if an administrative employee granted permits illegally. Allegedly, crowd size versus the venue and safety concerns came up a lot in meetings and emails, like repeatedly over several months. And that's why they ended up at 250,000 being their actual working capacity, even though that was still too high. It also discussed having mobile patrols in the tunnel, 70 security guards in the entrance and tunnel area, and the head of security for the entrance area actually be at the tunnel ramp so that they could close the entrance as necessary for congestion. Ironically, it also lists potential dangerous situations, including panic scenarios, but it determined that that situation would be extremely unlikely or impossible because of the high noise level, so no plan to prevent that was actually included. Other documents showed contracts with the professor to go over visitor flow management, and the professor told them that constant information for visitors using loudspeakers was essential in case of closures due to high amounts of people in the area. He also suggested having the organizer record the number of people coming in. The month leading up to the festival, the building inspector reached out to Lopevent asking them to submit missing documents for their application for the Love Parade to be approved. They were missing their final security concept that needed to be based on the new location and not on previous locations, and fire safety plans. They noted that what they were given of the security concept wasn't created working with the department that oversees it, and that they shouldn't be referencing other agreements or meetings in their current plan. And like in all of the meetings and communications leading up to this point, kept saying that their estimates told them they could have 2.5 visitors per square meter. And then this guy's like, no, it's not 2.5, it should just be 2. What is 2.5 people? And because of that, based solely on what they had given the guy so far, their actual max number of visitors at the same time was 220,000. But they also needed to consider the catering and food service area, which reduces their amount. And then they had to consider escape routes. Whatever they sent him would only let 1/3 of people safely evacuate, which is against regulations. That little dress down from the guy was sent to other departments in the city administration, including the mayor. And now allegedly, remember, this is alleged, in an internal note after a meeting with members of the fire department, city administration, and Lopevent, 3 critical issues stood out. The first was their fire safety plan needed to be developed by experts. The second was that the number of visitors per square meter in the event area would need to be at a maximum 2. To this point, Lopevent still disagreed. They stood by their 2.5. And the third was that the evacuation plan needed to be made to standard. Allegedly, Lopevent believed escape options for 33% of visitors was good enough. Quote, real problems, not legal ones, should play a role. End quote. Allegedly, at this meeting was Wolfgang Rabe, a department head in the public order office. At this meeting, he pointed out that the mayor wanted the event, so a solution had to be found. So Lopevent would get help from the fire department and approve authorities to create a new evacuation plan. Since the mayor wanted the festival to go on, Lopevent should get the assistance it needed. So Wolfgang suggested a meeting with the fire department, Lopevent, Department 62, which was building supervision, and they were to come up with an evacuation plan that the professor would approve. The professor's approval should be enough of a green light for the building supervision department to also approve it. The internal note that contained all of this information also had a note on it that was written by a department head responsible for approving the Love Parade. That note said, quote, "Due to this problem, I reject the authority and responsibility of V6, which is the department. This in no way corresponds to orderly administrative action and appropriate project management. The decision in all matters rests with 2, end quote. 2 being a reference to Wolfgang's job title. Now, after that meeting, there was, of course, another meeting where all the parties present agreed that creating an escape analysis could justify them not following normal requirements for escape routes. But if the results of the analysis was different, the event would not be approved by the building inspector. Lopevent didn't have what they needed to have done in time, so the company's lawyer asked for an extension and getting the missing documents to the inspector, which brings us to July 14th, 2010, where a brief look at the application for the Love Parade showed that documents were still missing. Their deadline for the extension that they were given ended 7 days before that, allegedly. The reason for the denial was because the plan for the event area was still not up to date. The fire safety plan was missing, although that was expected. Building plans were still missing, the security concept was not up to date, and many, many more documents were just not there. The new deadline was the end of the week. 2 days later, Lopevent's event description said that the responsibility for detailed planning of the entrance and exit routes was on the city of Duisburg. It said that the max number of visitors is 250,000, which is within regulations for an event space of that size at 1.1 billion square feet or 110,000 square meters. It mentioned that the tunnels were important since they were the only access points and would be blocked if necessary. There would be 100 Lopevent security guards to handle the crowd in the tunnel area and manage visitor flow. The head of security for the entrance area would be located at the ramp in the middle of the tunnel area, and 17 cameras would monitor the entire thing. The cameras would allow them to see the number of visitors at any given time to get a precise calculation. In the section of the event description that goes over different dangerous scenarios, put panic situations as impossible or hardly having any negative effect. Now, Wolfgang Rabe was called to testify, and he said that the mayor appointed him to oversee everything, which explains a lot. He admitted to emailing the organization, company, and influencing the defendants from the building authority. He pressured members of city council because he believed that some of them were against approving the Love Parade, but by pushing it through the council, it sped up the approval process. Wolfgang figured he was the main bully behind it, but he wasn't the person who made the final call to go ahead. That was the building authority. The courts asked Wolfgang how he found out about the professor, and Wolfgang said that before the 2006 World Cup, the professor declared half of German stadiums unsafe. He didn't want the professor to do that same thing to the Love Parade. By having him involved early on, like at the beginning, the professor would be less likely to cancel the event at the last minute. But if the professor had said it wasn't safe and canceled, Wolfgang claims he would have complied. When Wolfgang met the professor 2 months before the parade, the professor wanted to write a review, but Wolfgang didn't think there was enough time for all of that. So he told the professor to just take a look at what they already had. No questions asked, no thorough examination of documents. The professor's fee was originally supposed to be 10,000 euros, but Wolfgang said the professor's assistant felt like that wasn't enough, so the professor was given 20,000 euros. It wasn't a bribe. Wolfgang said that if the professor had to do more work, he simply would have gotten more pay. He didn't do that kind of flat rate with anyone else, only the professor, because he wanted him on board. Even though the professor still had concerns, he still approved the event. The expert reviewer, Jürgen Latch, was assigned with figuring out prevention and causes related to the Love Parade. So he put together an almost 4,000-page report with the goal of determining if the disaster could have been prevented on that day or at that location ever. As far as on that day, Jürgen says the event should have been canceled. The grounds weren't suitable for the event or capacity of people, and was extremely high risk from the very beginning. He also had a simulation program that allowed him to test different scenarios. And regardless of if police lines were there or not, the bottleneck was going to happen anyway. The design, lack of space, poor planning, and sheer volume of people meant that there would have been that extreme crowding regardless. He didn't explicitly say that the crowding would have been deadly regardless, but given that there were at least 250,000 people there and only 3,200 police officers, when you factor in everything else that played a part, the officers were probably just a drop in the bucket, if that at all. And some of them did save lives by pulling people from the crowd. Jürgen was never asked to testify in court. By January of 2019, less than 100 days in court, legal professionals weighing in on the case felt the defendant's guilt was minimal, even if proven guilty later. So 6 city council members and 1 Lope event employee had their charges dropped. CEO Raina Shala and Mayor Adolf Sauerland weren't charged because by the time the courts took the case, the statutes against them had expired. The court wanted to close the case against the remaining Lope event employees with a 10,000 euro settlement. Now, German courts determine guilt by determining if defendants are guilty of charges and then looking at how large their individual culpability is. The presiding judge believed multiple independent factors were responsible for what happened that day. Defendants had 3 weeks to agree to what the court suggested with this, but the court did continue listening to witnesses during that time. One of the Lope event employees would end up rejecting having the case closed with or without financial settlements, and that's because in Germany, when a case closes because of the statute of limitations, the state covers the cost of fees and lawyers too. With the settlement, defendants have to cover their lawyer fees and even sometimes the plaintiff legal fees. Families were disappointed, but they did understand how all 10 defendants couldn't be held fully responsible, but they still all hoped for a different outcome. They were looking for an explanation on what happened, compensation, and sentencing. The defendant's deadline to accept the court proposal was February 5th, 2019. All 7 of the people who had their charges dropped went home without having to pay settlement fees because their level of guilt was considered too small to actually attach a settlement amount to. But the courts felt the 3 remaining Lope event employees should have to pay for the deaths of 21 people. By month 15 of the trial, the public and the press had lost interest. It was hardly reported on, and when the former defendants and employees were called back to testify against the remaining defendants, most of them either didn't want to testify or claimed that they couldn't remember anything. But somehow, when it came to asking questions about the police or blaming the police, those same defendants could suddenly remember every single detail. By month 21 of the trial, COVID-19 hit. No person or group was made responsible for what happened. A court spokesman said that they would have closed the case regardless of the pandemic because the defendants' actions alone didn't cause the disaster. There was a long planning period, so things weren't limited to what happened on the day of the festival. To the court, multiple institutions contributed and were involved. In order to measure individual guilt, you can't ignore what other parties did. You need a broad overview of what happened to determine the cause. If they were going to blame the defendants, how much blame would each person get? According to the courts, the defendants didn't act carelessly. They tried to put together a safe event, but just failed at doing so. Ultimately, by the time the trial wrapped up, the Love Parade had happened about 10 years prior, and the court felt that the incident left a mark on the defendants and was emotionally draining for them and plaintiffs. So basically, they already learned their lesson. In Germany, to close a case, it really only requires the prosecutors and defendants to agree. Plaintiffs have no say. While families were obviously extremely unhappy with the decision, many people were left with a bitter taste in their mouth following this. They believed the trial covered up a lot instead of intensely investigating, and it's my understanding that what I revealed with the meetings and documents may not have been brought up in court, so they're not wrong. An inquiry should have started immediately. Legal teams involved felt like those who stood to profit were able to make a mess of everything through finger pointing in interviews and using the press to their advantage immediately following the love parade. That muddied the waters on who should and would be held responsible. Politicians felt that the court trial would bring a sense of peace and that the court would handle that part for them. Survivors and families of victims felt that this wasn't fair because they didn't even finish the trial. It would be different if a fair trial with a guilty or not guilty verdict happened, but they didn't even finish the trial. They blamed COVID and let the clock run out. One pair of parents considered going to the European Court of Human Rights, where Article 6 of the European Convention of Human Rights guarantees a trial for all members of the Council of Europe, but ultimately, I think that they didn't do that. Families felt forced to accept what happened. Courts felt like they couldn't identify a villain, someone who acted out of self-interest and ignored warnings. Honestly, I don't know how they managed to do that. I'm sure there are so many more layers to this onion. My heart goes out to the victims and those who knew them. And honestly, anyone who's been in a situation like this, reading witness statements was a lot. I only used a handful of what was available, but hopefully the next time you find yourself in a crowd, waiting in line, and you feel that very human urge to try and walk forwards to get the people in front of you to move faster, you think twice about it and maybe don't do it. The Love Parade is one of so many disasters like it that still happen today. And because of that, this is now post-editing and recording Tatiana, because I'd be remiss if I didn't hit on this specific point. And I hesitate to say anything because no one was officially made guilty, legally, in the courts anyway. But it is my opinion that anyone who had a hand in organizing this was told, hey, you shouldn't do this. You need to have this in place. You shouldn't be putting X, Y, and Z over the safety of people. Those who signed off on it, those are ultimately who should have been the ones to hold responsibility for this tragedy happening. I don't think anyone in the crowd should be blamed. Even the people panicking and crawling over and walking on top of people's heads through the crowd, I think you never know how you're going to act in that situation until you're in it. I can't picture myself doing that, but I have not been in a situation like that before. Now, with respect to the actions of police that day, I did see that they were allegedly guarding fences and making things more confusing. I did see that one or two maybe helped people out, but with the way things are set up and the way it was planned, it was clear that regardless of those there working that day, whatever they did, something like this was going to happen. To the point where the ramp flooring was considered sloppy, because allegedly 15 of the people died near the stairs because they stumbled over a broken sewer lid and people just piled up on top of them. It really just falls, in my opinion, on the organizers. Hindsight's 2020. You would think those there would see what's happening and do one thing, but who knows until you're in that situation. And then you look at this crowd, which I will have pictures and videos up on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook, which you can find in the show notes. But the sheer amount of people in this area, I bet everyone was so overwhelmed. Now, with that being said, I saw something in an interview that I wanted to point out because their thinking and thought process leading up to what happened and after, once they realized that people had died, it's something that more attention should be brought to. I think it could prevent this from happening in the future because, again, this still happens to this day. In the interview, they said they were with their friends on the ramp and they noticed people coming towards them. So someone asked them, hey, how's the party? Why are you leaving already? And those people told them that they couldn't get up there because it was too crowded. Now, that person with their friends, they were determined because they didn't think that could be possible. One of their friends even said, this is the Love Parade. They know how many people are going to be here. Of course, we'll all be able to get in there easily. Everyone there is agreeing. Of course we'll be able to get up there. They're coming up mentally with whatever reason makes sense to them as to why people who are at the Love Parade and probably understand how big it gets are still saying it's too crowded. They're just kind of dismissing it. Now, not one person in that group had a single thought to turn around, to really take in what they were saying. You know, it's too crowded. A place that's supposed to hold millions of people. They're there at the same event, and they're saying it felt too crowded. They couldn't get in. So no one even considered turning around in that friend group. They didn't want to think that they traveled all of this way for nothing. Hours and hours. They're spending money to be there. Time. They're just feet away from the entrance. The entrance to the parade was around 300 meters, which is around 984 feet or so long. But because of that, they're feet away, they're excited, they wanted to enjoy the festival. It was canceled before, and everyone is just thinking, if we just keep pushing forward, we keep waiting, we walk forward, we push, everyone's going to move, there's room for everyone to get in. We want to go, we want to party. Understandably, it never occurred to them that those organizing this event, those who had a hand in keeping people safe, didn't actually plan an event that would keep people safe. They didn't plan an event that would have kept 1 million people safe, let alone the amount that actually did show up. Those waiting assumed an event that usually has upwards of 1 million people would be able to have them there comfortably. They couldn't even consider or fathom the possibility that that wasn't the truth of the matter. At the end of the day, there's like 10 things I could list off the top of my head that should have been done differently, that wasn't even named in this episode. Things that honestly, if even one of them had been done, the ending for this would have been so different. But most of what they should have done was in the recommendations or basic regulations for having events like this. But because those rules and regulations were ignored, and what do I always say? Rules and regulations are written in blood. They're written in blood because people were severely hurt or killed to get them there, in stone. But I think that this event is the perfect example of why you can't just blindly trust that everyone is going to do what they should do, that they are going to follow whatever rules, laws, or logical thinking should be followed in order for people to come attend something that they paid to be there for and enjoy it and be safe about it. I'm not saying we need to panic over large-scale events or anything like that. Just the next time you have the urge to push forward, think about why no one is moving yet. And please, stay safe, and I'll be back on Thursday. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.